Tonight, we continue our long-form journey through the origins of the Second World War with Episode 2. In the last episode, we explored the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and the creation of the League of Nations. Now, as you settle in and let the day fade, we'll drift into the story of the Russian Revolution, the unrest, the shortages, and the turning points that reshaped an empire and set the stage for the world that followed. I've spent a great deal of time researching and crafting this narrative so it can guide you gently towards sleep while still giving you a clear, steady understanding of the past. If this calm narrative style helps you rest, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe. And if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time of night you've joined us. It's always meaningful to know who is listening from around the world. Take a slow breath, and let's begin. On a cool evening in Petrograd, when the daylight had finally thinned into a soft, amber haze, Galina Sukhanova moved quietly through her small apartment. The city outside was unsettled, restless in the way only a capital in the midst of revolution can be. Yet her rooms felt still, almost suspended in time. She arranged teacups on a low table, set out simple sandwiches, and listened to the faint hum of distant street noise drifting through the window panes. She had not told her husband about the gathering she was preparing for. Earlier that morning, as he buttoned his coat and headed toward his newspaper office, she had gently suggested that he stay there overnight. It was a reasonable request in a city where darkness brought uncertainty, and he had agreed without hesitation. They were a devoted couple, loyal in affection if not in ideology. He belonged to the Mensheviks. She, quietly but firmly, stood with the Bolsheviks. As she worked, she felt a subtle thrill, a sense of participating in something hidden, something momentous. She had been asked to lend her apartment for a confidential meeting of the Bolshevik Central Committee, and the honor of that request warmed her with a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. She could not have known that this night, October 23rd, 1917, would become one of those rare moments when history shifts its weight, when decisions made in cramped rooms ripple outward across continents and decades. She could not have known that the choice made here would help reshape Russia into the world's first communist state, sever its ties with wartime allies, and send tremors through the international order that would echo all the way to the threshold of a second global conflict, and far beyond. As night settled fully over Petrograd, her guests began to arrive. One by one, 12 men stepped through the doorway, their coats damp with evening mist, their faces drawn with the strain of clandestine work. Among them were 3 figures whose names would soon become inseparable from the fate of Russia itself. There was Lev Davidovich Bronstein, Trotsky, sharp-eyed, intense, carrying himself with the restless energy of a man who lived in perpetual motion. There was Iosif Vissarionovich Dugashvili, Stalin, quiet, unreadable, his expression masked behind a steady, unblinking calm. And there was the man who had summoned them all, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin, arriving in disguise, his bald head hidden beneath a thick wig, tinted glasses obscuring his features. He was wanted by the authorities, accused of treason, hunted by political enemies. Yet he moved with the certainty of someone who believed history itself was waiting for him. Lenin wasted no time. As soon as the men settled into the cramped room, he pressed his case with the urgency of someone who felt the moment slipping away. The provisional government, he insisted, must be overthrown at once. There was no need to list its failures. Every man in the room knew them intimately. It was indecisive, tangled in procedure, and still committed to continuing the war against Germany, honoring promises made by the fallen Tsar to capitalist allies in the West. The Russian people, Lenin argued, were exhausted. They wanted peace, land, and relief from the grinding weight of war. Delay, he warned, would be unforgivable. He was 47 years old, hardened by 17 years of exile, agitation, and relentless ideological struggle. Now, he believed, the hour he had waited for had finally arrived. But the room did not immediately bend to his will. Trotsky would later recall the debate as stormy and chaotic, a clash not just of tactics but of fundamental visions for the party's future. Voices rose, arguments spiraled, and the discussion drifted repeatedly toward the philosophical roots of their movement. Lenin, however, kept pulling them back, again and again, to the single point that mattered: insurrection. Not later. Not eventually. Now. Stalin remained silent through most of it, smoking his pipe with an expression that revealed nothing. He watched, listened, and waited. As the night stretched toward dawn, the air in the apartment grew heavy with smoke and tension. Finally, Lenin seized a scrap of paper, a torn page from a child's school notebook, and scribbled a resolution in blunt, forceful strokes. The party calls for the organization of an armed insurrection. When the vote was taken, 10 supported the motion. 2 opposed it. Trotsky and Stalin were among those who voted in favor. 13 days later, after a nearly bloodless coup, Lenin stood before the All-Russian Congress of Soviets as the head of a new government. His suit was rumpled, his appearance unremarkable, but his triumph was unmistakable. "Comrades," he declared, "the workers' and peasants' revolution has come to pass." He had perhaps 200,000 followers in a nation of 150 million, a fraction so small it seemed almost absurd. Yet from that tiny minority, Lenin would forge a government that held Russia in an unyielding grip. Revolution was not new to Russia, but the form it was now taking, sharp, uncompromising, and absolute, was something few had imagined. And it had begun, quietly, in a modest Petrograd apartment, on a night when the world outside seemed to hold its breath. Long before the storm of 1917 broke across Russia, the idea of revolution had been quietly gathering strength, like distant thunder rolling beneath an overcast sky. For decades, the empire had lived under the weight of a rigid autocracy, and beneath that weight, pressure built slowly, almost imperceptibly, until it began to seep into every corner of Russian life. Most people who spoke of revolution in those earlier years did not imagine barricades or the collapse of dynasties. What they longed for was something gentler, something rooted in dignity rather than upheaval. They wanted the right to speak freely, to gather without fear, to publish ideas without the shadow of censorship. They wanted a government that listened rather than commanded. They wanted a life where the police were not a constant presence, watching, recording, waiting. These early critics came largely from the educated classes, the intelligentsia, noble families with a conscience, and men and women who felt a moral responsibility toward the suffering they saw around them. They were not revolutionaries in the modern sense. They were reformers, idealists, people who believed that Russia could be improved without being torn apart. But the reality of Russian life made such hopes difficult to sustain. Even after serfdom was abolished, the peasants who had once been bound to the land found themselves burdened with yearly redemption payments, a cruel reminder that freedom had come with a price they could scarcely afford. Their lives remained harsh, their prospects limited, their labor still tied to the demands of former masters. Those who fled the countryside in search of something better discovered that the cities offered little relief. Factories demanded 15-hour days. Mines demanded 18. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and the rhythm of life was dictated by machines that never seemed to rest. For many, the promise of industrial progress felt more like a new kind of bondage. When Nicholas II ascended the throne in 1894, he made his intentions unmistakably clear. He dismissed the aspirations of his liberal subjects as senseless dreams, a phrase that echoed across the empire like a door being shut. His refusal to bend, even slightly, pushed many who had once hoped for peaceful reform toward more radical paths. The mood of the country began to shift. The quiet discussions that had once taken place in drawing rooms and university halls grew sharper, more urgent. The clandestine discussion circles that had once debated philosophy and literature now turned their attention to strategy, organization, and resistance. Activism replaced contemplation. Secrecy became an art form. Letters carried hidden messages written in milk between the lines. Code names replaced real identities. Illegal pamphlets traveled across the empire in false-bottomed trunks. The underground world of political dissent grew more sophisticated, more determined, and more willing to challenge the state directly. Through exiles and émigrés living abroad, Russians at home became increasingly familiar with the writings of Karl Marx. His ideas, the vision of a proletarian revolution rising from the ruins of capitalism, resonated deeply with those who saw no hope in the existing order. Marx had died only a decade before Nicholas II took the throne, but his influence was already spreading through the empire like a quiet, persistent tide. By the opening years of the 20th century, the Russian Empire felt like a vast, aging machine grinding under its own weight. The tension that had been building for decades, in the countryside, in the factories, in the minds of students and intellectuals, finally reached a breaking point in 1905. What followed was not yet the revolution that would topple the Romanovs, but it was the first unmistakable tremor, the first deep crack in the old order. The spark came from far beyond Russia's western borders. A disastrous war with Japan, fought over influence in East Asia, exposed the fragility of the Tsarist state. Military defeats piled up with humiliating speed, and the public, already weary of hardship, began to question the competence of the regime. Criticism that had once been whispered now spilled openly into the streets. On a cold January Sunday, thousands of striking factory workers and their families gathered in St. Petersburg. They carried icons, portraits of the Tsar, and petitions written in careful, hopeful language. They believed, or wanted to believe, that the Tsar would listen to them if only they could reach him. They marched toward the Winter Palace with a kind of solemn dignity, their breath rising in pale clouds against the winter air. They were met with gunfire. The troops opened fire on the unarmed crowd, and the snow-covered square was stained with the blood of men, women, and children. The event became known as Bloody Sunday, and its impact reverberated through the empire like a shockwave. The image of the Tsar as a benevolent father figure, a protector of his people, shattered instantly. Trust dissolved. Anger took its place. In the months that followed, Russia descended into a kind of rolling chaos. Strikes erupted in major cities. Peasants rose up in violent protest, attacking estates and seizing land. Soldiers and sailors mutinied, their loyalty eroded by years of mistreatment and the sting of military defeat. Government officials were assassinated with alarming regularity. The empire seemed to sway on its foundations, as if unsure whether it would hold together or collapse entirely. Counter-terror swept through the cities. The violence was not confined to political targets. Pogroms erupted against vulnerable minorities, Jews in the Ukraine, Armenians in Azerbaijan, adding layers of tragedy to an already turbulent year. The social fabric of the empire frayed visibly, thread by thread. In October, a general strike brought the country to a standstill. Factories fell silent, railways halted, offices emptied, and in St. Petersburg, something unprecedented took shape: a Soviet of workers' deputies. The word Soviet simply meant council, but in this new context, it carried a sense of possibility that electrified the political landscape. Workers, for the first time, organized themselves into a body that claimed to speak for them directly. The government, alarmed by this new development, eventually disbanded the Soviet by force. But the idea had taken root. The memory of that council, its structure, its purpose, its potential, would linger in the minds of workers and revolutionaries alike. Under immense pressure, Nicholas II reluctantly agreed to create a parliament, the Duma. It was meant to be a concession, a gesture toward reform. But the gesture was hollow. Soldiers, sailors, students, women, and anyone under 25 were barred from voting. The Duma had no authority over the Tsar's ministers. It could debate, but it could not govern. Still, the Duma became a stage for dissent. Its members spoke boldly, demanding amnesty for political prisoners, land redistribution, and greater civil liberties. Nicholas dissolved the first Duma after only 2 months. The second met the same fate. But the institution persisted. A third Duma functioned, then a fourth. With each iteration, the debates grew sharper, the criticism more pointed. By the time the fourth Duma convened, it had become a central forum for political struggle. A place where the empire's tensions were laid bare, where the old order was challenged not with weapons but with words. The events of 1905 did not topple the Romanovs, but they changed Russia irrevocably. They revealed the depth of public anger, the fragility of the autocracy, and the power of organized resistance. They introduced the concept of the Soviet, a workers' council that would one day become the backbone of a new state. And they marked the beginning of a long, slow unraveling that would culminate in the upheavals of 1917. The empire had survived the shock, but it had been weakened, and the ground beneath it had begun to shift. The revolution that would one day sweep across Russia had taken its first breath. When the summer of 1914 arrived, Russia found itself drifting toward a conflict that would test the very limits of its endurance. The empire was vast, stretching across continents and climates, but beneath its size lay a fragile political structure and a population already strained by decades of hardship. Yet when Germany declared war on August 1st, a wave of patriotic fervor swept across the country with surprising force. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the empire had rediscovered a sense of unity. Members of the Duma, often divided, often critical, rose to proclaim their loyalty. Workers pledged not to strike. Crowds gathered outside the Winter Palace, the same square where blood had been spilled in 1905, and knelt in reverence as the imperial couple appeared on the balcony. The air was thick with emotion, with the belief that this war might offer a chance for national renewal. Even the city itself was reshaped by the moment. St. Petersburg, with its Germanic name, was rechristened Petrograd, a symbolic gesture meant to sever any hint of kinship with the enemy. 10 years later, it would be renamed again, but for now, the new name carried a sense of patriotic resolve. The government even banned the production of vodka, a cherished national tradition, in an effort to conserve grain for the war effort. It was a sacrifice many accepted reluctantly, but it spoke to the seriousness of the moment. Yet this surge of unity was fragile, and it began to fade almost as quickly as it had appeared. By the end of August, the illusion of strength had shattered. At the Battle of Tannenberg, more than 100,000 Russian soldiers were killed, and another 93,000 were taken prisoner. The defeat was catastrophic, not only in numbers but in symbolism. It revealed, with painful clarity, the weaknesses that had long been hidden beneath the surface of the empire. Russia had mobilized immense forces at the urging of its French and British allies, sending troops across the plains of Russian Poland in a matter of days. But the speed of mobilization masked deeper problems. The soldiers were poorly trained. Supply lines were unreliable. Communication between units was inconsistent at best. The army was vast, but it was not prepared for the demands of modern warfare. Even later victories could not erase the trauma of Tannenberg. The defeat became a kind of national wound, a reminder of everything that was failing within the empire. It exposed a bureaucracy that had neglected the basics: roads, railways, infrastructure, and a military leadership that seemed out of touch with the realities of the battlefield. The Minister of War even boasted that he had not read a book on military science in 20 years, a statement that felt almost surreal in the face of mounting losses. The shortages were staggering. 1 million artillery shells were being fired each month, but only a fraction of that number were being produced. Rifles were so scarce that infantrymen were ordered to advance unarmed, hoping to pick up weapons from fallen comrades before reaching the enemy. It was a grim, almost unimaginable reality, one that spoke to the desperation of the moment. Russia's greatest resource was manpower, but it was spent with a recklessness that bordered on tragic. Of the 15 million soldiers called to serve during the war, more than 4 million would die in action. The scale of loss was almost beyond comprehension. In September 1915, Nicholas II made a fateful decision. He took personal command of the army and moved to the military headquarters at Mogilev. The idea, it seemed, was not entirely his own. His wife, Alexandra, German-born, strong-willed, and fiercely devoted, had urged him repeatedly to assert himself, to show the firmness she believed the empire needed. Her letters were filled with pleas for him to be decisive, to lead with authority, to thump with your hand upon the table. Nicholas, gentle by nature and often uncertain, signed his replies as, "Your poor little weak-willed hubby," a revealing glimpse into the dynamic between them. With the Tsar away from Petrograd, Alexandra effectively became the acting ruler of Russia. It was a role she embraced with determination, but her influence and her German heritage would soon become a source of deep suspicion among the public. Meanwhile, the war continued to unravel. By 1917, the Russian army had lost its ability to threaten the Germans in any meaningful way. German forces occupied parts of southwestern Russia and seized valuable crops. In the cities, shortages grew severe. Food was scarce. Fuel was scarce. Patience was scarce. Long lines formed for basic necessities, and prices soared to levels that felt almost unreal. Flour cost nearly 8 times what it had before the war, meat 6 times, salt 5 times. The hardships fed a growing anger, and that anger increasingly turned toward the monarchy. Rumors spread that the Tsarina, that German woman, as she was called by many, was somehow responsible for Russia's misfortunes. A dark joke circulated. A general finds the young Tsarevich crying in a palace corridor and asks why. The boy replies, "When the Russians are beaten, Papa cries. When the Germans are beaten, Mama cries. When, then, am I to cry?" It was a small story, but it captured the mood of the moment. A sense that the imperial family was out of step with the suffering of the people, that the war was being mismanaged, that the empire was drifting toward disaster. The stage was set. The pressures of war had pushed Russia to the brink. The unity of 1914 had dissolved into frustration, hunger, and despair. And beneath it all, the forces that had been gathering for years, the anger, the disillusionment, the desire for change, were beginning to rise again, preparing to break the surface. The revolution that followed was not planned, not orchestrated by any party or leader. As one historian later wrote, the mass moved of itself. It began with women, textile workers who had endured long hours, low wages, and empty shelves. They marched into the city center demanding bread, their voices rising in sharp, urgent chants that echoed through the streets. Metallurgical workers, recently locked out after a wage dispute, joined them. The crowd swelled, not with political slogans but with hunger and frustration. The next day, 200,000 workers went on strike. Clashes with the police grew more frequent, though still scattered and uncoordinated. By the third day, Petrograd felt as though it had been overtaken by a restless tide. People poured into the streets, angry, cold, hungry, and ready for anything. Shops were looted. Police stations were set ablaze. The city's fragile order began to crumble. Cossack horsemen, long feared as the Tsar's enforcers, rode in to disperse the crowds. But something had changed. Observers noticed that some Cossacks were exchanging friendly words with the demonstrators, their loyalty wavering in the face of the people's desperation. That evening, Nicholas sent a terse telegram to the commander of the Petrograd garrison. "I order that the disorders be stopped by tomorrow." But the garrison was no longer a reliable force. Most of its 200,000 men were new recruits or soldiers recovering from wounds, men who had seen the war up close and had little appetite for suppressing their own countrymen. When ordered into the streets, one unit after another turned on its officers, shot them, and joined the demonstrators. 5 days after the unrest began, the revolution revealed its true nature. The restraints that had held the empire together, fear, obedience, habit, snapped. Police were overwhelmed. Government buildings were seized. Prisons were thrown open. The old order, so rigid and unyielding, collapsed with startling speed. The president of the Duma sent an urgent message to the Tsar. The last hour has struck when the fate of the dynasty and the country is being decided. Nicholas's reply was characteristic of his reign. Dissolve the Duma. It was the same remedy he had used in earlier crises, but this time it had no force behind it. The Duma ignored the order and instead formed a provisional committee to restore order in Petrograd. Quietly, without ceremony, that committee became the provisional government. But power in Petrograd did not belong to a single body. Another force had emerged, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies. It was a chaotic, energetic assembly of factory workers, mutinous soldiers, left-leaning Duma members, and newly freed political prisoners. The Soviet took over a wing of the same palace that housed the provisional government, watching its every move. The two bodies were bound together by necessity, yet divided by ideology. One had responsibility without power. The other had power without responsibility. The tension between them would shape the months to come. On March 2nd, as his train traveled through the countryside, Nicholas received two envoys from the provisional government. They carried a request and an ultimatum. The Tsar must abdicate. His generals had already urged him to do the same. The monarchy had reached its end. Nicholas signed the act of abdication with outward calm, though he wavered briefly, first naming his son as successor, then changing his mind and passing the throne to his brother, Grand Duke Mikhail. Mikhail refused, calling instead for a freely elected government. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for more than 3 centuries, was finished. The provisional government welcomed the idea of a democratic future. But within a month, a new figure returned from exile, a man whose vision for Russia was far more radical, far more uncompromising, and far more transformative than anything the provisional government imagined. His name was Vladimir Lenin. Long before Lenin became the figure who would reshape Russia's destiny, he was simply Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, a boy raised in a comfortable, educated household in the quiet city of Simbirsk. His father, a respected inspector of schools, had been honored by the Tsarist regime for his service to education. The family lived modestly but securely, surrounded by books, ideas, and the expectation that each child would contribute something meaningful to the world. Yet from this seemingly ordinary upbringing emerged 6 children who would all, in one way or another, turn against the very system that had rewarded their father. The seeds of rebellion were planted early, but they took root abruptly when Lenin was 17. His older brother, Alexander, a university student with a sharp mind and a passionate sense of justice, was arrested for participating in a plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. He was convicted and hanged. The execution shattered the family and marked Lenin permanently. The event did not simply grieve him, it redirected him. The quiet, studious young man became consumed by a new purpose. He turned his attention toward the forces that shaped society, toward the injustices he believed had taken his brother's life, and toward the revolutionary ideas that were beginning to circulate among Russia's discontented youth. Within a few years, Lenin himself was in trouble. He was expelled from the University of Kazan for involvement in student protests, a moment that pushed him deeper into the world of political activism. He moved to St. Petersburg, studied law, and even practiced briefly as a lawyer. But the courtroom held little appeal for him. He had discovered Marxism, and with it, a calling that felt far more urgent. Lenin's early activism drew the attention of the secret police. When he helped organize a group called the Union of Struggle for the Liberation of the Working Class, the authorities arrested him and sentenced him to exile in Siberia, Russia's vast, frozen repository for political dissidents. It was there, in the quiet isolation of the Siberian countryside, that Lenin's life took another defining turn. In 1898, he married Nadezhda Krupskaya, a fellow Marxist who had also been exiled for her political activities. The Tsarist regime, in a curious display of leniency, allowed radical couples who claimed to be engaged to live together in banishment, provided they agreed to marry in the rites of the Orthodox Church. Lenin and Krupskaya temporarily set aside their militant atheism, went through the ceremony, and even accepted wedding rings. she would secretly keep hers for the rest of her life. When Lenin's 3-year sentence ended, he and Krupskaya left Russia almost immediately. Traveling abroad was surprisingly easy under the old regime, far easier than it would be under the communists later, and many politically active Russians took advantage of the opportunity. They did not see themselves as exiles but as temporary émigrés, preparing for the day when the Romanovs would fall and they could return home. For Lenin, this period abroad became a defining chapter. He spent the next 17 years moving between European cities: London, Paris, Geneva, Zurich, Bern, Munich, living modestly, writing constantly, and working tirelessly to build a revolutionary movement. He hiked in the Alps, cycled through the forests near Fontainebleau, and spent long days in the reading room of the British Museum, poring over books and refining his ideas. Despite these occasional moments of leisure, Lenin was not a man known for warmth or ease. He was austere in his habits, brusque in conversation, and often impatient with anything that did not serve his purpose. The writer Maxim Gorky, who admired him deeply, once said that Lenin's mind had the cold glitter of steel shavings. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of a fanatic, unwavering, disciplined, and utterly consumed by his vision. During these years, Lenin helped found and edit Iskra, the Spark, a newspaper intended to ignite revolutionary consciousness across Russia. Its motto, printed boldly on the front page, declared, "First the spark, then the conflagration." It was both a promise and a warning. Iskra became the voice of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, formed in 1898 from various underground workers' groups. But Lenin soon found himself at odds with many of the party's supporters. They believed that revolution would come slowly, after years of educating and organizing the working class. Lenin had no patience for such gradualism. He envisioned a tightly disciplined party, a vanguard, that would seize power and lead the masses, not wait for them. In 1903, at a party congress in Brussels, later moved to London after Belgian police intervened, Lenin unveiled his proposal to restrict party membership to a small, elite core. The idea shocked many delegates. They feared that such a structure would place too much power in the hands of too few. Lenin was voted down. But fate intervened. A procedural dispute caused several delegates to walk out, and Lenin seized the moment. He won control of Iskra and prevailed on several organizational points. From that moment, his faction became known as the Bolsheviks, the majority, while his opponents became the Mensheviks, the minority, even though the Mensheviks often held the actual majority in later councils. The split deepened quickly. Lenin despised the Mensheviks for modeling themselves after the moralistic social democratic parties of Western Europe. The Mensheviks, in turn, were appalled when Bolshevik operatives in Russia began robbing banks. They called them expropriations, to fund their activities. These robberies were carried out under the direction of a rising Bolshevik figure named Stalin. By the time the revolution of February 1917 erupted, Lenin was living in Switzerland. At first, he refused to believe the news. Then, once convinced, he became desperate to return home. But Russia was separated from him by Germany, enemy territory. He considered traveling under a false Swedish passport, pretending to be a deaf-mute. Krupskaya dismissed the idea. "You might dream and curse in your sleep," she warned, "and they would discover you were no Swede." A more daring plan emerged. Lenin would ask the Germans for safe passage. In exchange, He would urge the new Russian government to release an equal number of German internees. The Germans agreed. They had their own motives. They knew Lenin opposed the war and hoped he would help deepen Russia's internal turmoil. Lenin insisted that the train carrying him and his companions be sealed, so that no one could accuse him of collaborating with the enemy. In reality, the arrangement was less dramatic. The exiles were confined to a single car, isolated from the rest of the train. Among them was Inessa Armand, a French-born revolutionary who was both a close political ally and Lenin's mistress. As the train approached Petrograd, Lenin wondered aloud whether he would be arrested upon arrival. Instead, he was greeted with flowers, applause, and a formal reception in the very room where the Tsar had once welcomed foreign dignitaries. His return would change everything. When Lenin's train finally crossed into Petrograd in the spring of 1917, the city was wrapped in a restless, electric tension. The February Revolution had toppled the monarchy only weeks earlier, and the air still carried the strange mixture of hope and uncertainty that follows the collapse of an old order. Crowds gathered at stations, in factories, in the wide windswept squares, all searching for direction, for meaning, for someone who could explain what came next. Lenin, who had spent years in exile watching Russia's turmoil from afar, arrived with a sense of purpose sharpened by distance. He had wondered aloud whether he would be arrested the moment he stepped off the train. Instead, he was greeted with flowers, applause, and a formal reception in the same room where the Tsar had once welcomed foreign dignitaries. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The old world had vanished, and a new one was struggling to be born. The Petrograd Soviet sent an official delegation to greet him, led by its chairman, Nikolai Chaidze, a Menshevik. Their welcome was polite, even warm, but beneath the surface lay unease. The Mensheviks held a majority in the Soviet and played a leading role in the provisional government. Lenin, returning from exile with radical ideas and a reputation for uncompromising militancy, represented a force they did not fully trust. Chaidze spoke first, urging unity. "The principal task is now to defend our revolution," he said, expressing hope that Lenin would work alongside them. Lenin did not respond directly. Instead, he turned away from the officials and addressed the crowd of soldiers, sailors, and workers who had gathered to see him. He called them the vanguard of the international proletarian army, his voice rising with a fervor that startled even those who admired him. From the station, Lenin was escorted to Bolshevik headquarters, a former palace once owned by a celebrated ballerina. The contrast between the building's elegant past and its new revolutionary purpose was striking. Inside, a crowd waited, eager to hear what the long-absent leader would say. Lenin did not disappoint. Standing on a balcony, he launched into a blistering denunciation of the war. "Capitalist pirates," he declared, "are destroying Europe for the sake of the profits of a handful of exploiters." His voice carried across the courtyard, sharp and unyielding. To many, the words were shocking. Russia was still fighting Germany. Soldiers were still dying at the front. To call the war a capitalist crime felt dangerously close to treason. A soldier in the crowd shouted angrily, "You ought to stick a bayonet in a fellow like that. Must be a German." The tension was palpable. Even in revolutionary Petrograd, Lenin's rhetoric pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable. Inside, Lenin stunned the Bolshevik leadership with the force of his demands. There must be no support for the provisional government, he insisted. No cooperation with the Mensheviks. No compromise. The The Bolsheviks must adopt a new slogan, all power to the Soviets. His strategy was clear: seize control of the Petrograd Soviet, then use it as a springboard to take power across the country. Madame Sukhanova's husband, the Menshevik journalist who had attended the meeting, later wrote of Lenin's intensity. He kept hammering, hammering, hammering. I felt as if I had been beaten about the head with flails. It was not a metaphor. Lenin's presence had that effect, relentless, focused, impossible to ignore. The next day, Lenin condensed his ideas into a short, explosive document that would become known as the April Theses. The original handwritten outline, preserved today in a velvet frame in Moscow's Central Museum, reads like a blueprint for revolution. In it, Lenin added a striking new proposal. The Bolshevik Party would henceforth be known as the Communist Party, because, he argued, the social democratic parties of Europe had betrayed socialism by supporting their own governments in the war. Outside Russia, Lenin's return attracted little attention. Even in Petrograd, many believed he had destroyed his political future with his extreme statements. But one man saw the danger clearly: Alexander Kerensky. Kerensky, a gifted orator and rising political star, had known Lenin since childhood. Their families came from the same town, Simbirsk. Kerensky's father had even been Lenin's high school headmaster. Now, Kerensky served as Minister of War in the provisional government and would soon become its prime minister. He understood Lenin's ambition and his capacity for disruption. "This man will destroy the revolution," Kerensky warned. Their clash came quickly. In June, delegates from Soviets across the country gathered in Petrograd for the first All-Russian Congress of Soviets. When one speaker argued that no single party was strong enough to take power, Lenin interrupted, "There is." Laughter rippled through the hall. The Bolsheviks had only 105 delegates out of 822, but Lenin walked to the rostrum with absolute confidence. "We are prepared to assume power at any time," he declared. He promised to expose the unheard of war profits of capitalists, to jail dozens of them, and to offer peace by severing all ties with the capitalist world. A reporter described him pacing the platform like a caged beast, his eyes narrowing as if savoring the image of capitalists being paraded through the streets in cages. Kerensky rose to respond. "You Bolsheviks recommend childish prescriptions," he said. "Arrest, kill, destroy. What are you, socialists or police of the old regime?" The hall erupted. Delegates applauded Kerensky, but the galleries, packed with workers and soldiers, roared for Lenin. For Lenin, the moment was decisive. He now had the support of a man who would become his most valuable ally, Leon Trotsky. Trotsky had often sided with the Mensheviks in the past, but his revolutionary instincts aligned more closely with Lenin's. He had contributed to Iskra, chaired the St. Petersburg Soviet during the 1905 revolution, and possessed a rare combination of intellectual brilliance and practical daring. After hearing Lenin's arguments, Trotsky joined the Bolsheviks. Their partnership would change the course of Russian history. By the early summer of 1917, Russia felt as though it was suspended between two worlds, the old one collapsing in slow motion, the new one not yet fully formed. The provisional government struggled to project authority, but its power was thin, fragile, and constantly challenged by the Petrograd Soviet. The streets hummed with uncertainty. Factories echoed with arguments. Soldiers at the front wrote letters filled with despair. The entire nation seemed to sway, as if caught in a long, unsteady breath. Under pressure from the Allies, Minister of War Alexander Kerensky launched a new offensive against the Austrians in Galicia. He believed, sincerely and passionately, that Russia needed a victory, not only to honor its commitments, but to restore a sense of purpose to a country drifting toward chaos. If the enemy could be pushed back, he argued, perhaps the revolution could stabilize, perhaps the nation could find its footing again. But the offensive faltered almost immediately. The Germans counterattacked with devastating force, and the Russian lines crumbled. 1 million or more soldiers deserted, slipping away from the front in long, ragged streams. Many were driven not by cowardice but by a desperate desire to return home before their villages divided up the land seized from local landlords. The war had become a burden too heavy to bear. The army's morale, already fragile, collapsed. The Petrograd Soviet had earlier issued Order No. 1, which required the creation of regimental committees and erased many distinctions between officers and enlisted men. What had been intended as a democratic reform now contributed to the disintegration of discipline. Officers found themselves unable to command. Soldiers felt empowered to ignore orders. The army, once the backbone of the empire, was dissolving from within. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks were working tirelessly. Their newspapers spread across the country like windblown leaves, carrying messages of defiance and despair. Their agitators slipped into barracks, factories, and villages, urging soldiers to fraternize with the enemy and peasants to seize the estates of the wealthy. They understood the mood of the people, weary, hungry, angry, and they shaped their message accordingly. Their slogan was simple, powerful, and increasingly persuasive. Bread, land, and peace. In late July, the provisional government struck back. Lenin and several other Bolshevik leaders were indicted for treason, accused of inciting an uprising among the sailors at Kronstadt, the massive naval base in the Gulf of Finland. The government also claimed that the Bolsheviks were using German funds to fuel their agitation. Lenin, warned in advance, fled to Finland. Trotsky was arrested and jailed. From hiding, Lenin denied the accusations with fierce indignation. Later, when German archives were opened after the Second World War, they revealed that the Germans had indeed provided some support, not because Lenin was their agent, but because they believed he would deepen Russia's internal turmoil. The documents did not prove collaboration, but they did reveal the cold pragmatism with which Lenin pursued power. He accepted help from any source that could advance the revolution. Despite the absence of their leaders, the Bolsheviks continued their work. The party was not banned. Its members were not hunted. Its newspapers continued to circulate. And its message, sharpened by months of hardship, resonated more deeply with each passing week. By October, the Bolsheviks had achieved something remarkable. They held a majority in the Petrograd Soviet. The shift was dramatic, almost startling. The same body that had once been dominated by Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries now leaned decisively toward Lenin's party. Trotsky, recently released on bail, was elected chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. His charisma, his oratory, and his strategic brilliance made him the perfect figure to lead the next phase of the revolution. Lenin, still in hiding, recognized the moment. He decided to risk everything and return to Petrograd for a secret meeting of the Bolshevik Central Committee, the meeting held in Madame Sukhanova's apartment. The stage was set. The provisional government was weakened, isolated, and increasingly mistrusted. The army was disintegrating. The people were exhausted, and the Bolsheviks, disciplined, organized, and driven by a clear vision, were ready to act. The revolution that had begun almost by accident in February was about to be seized deliberately in October. By the autumn of 1917, Petrograd felt like a city holding its breath. The days were growing shorter, the air carried the first hints of winter, and beneath the surface of ordinary life, the trams rattling along Nevsky Prospect, the queues outside bakeries, the dim glow of street lamps flickering in the mist, something immense was gathering strength. The provisional government, exhausted and isolated, clung to authority with trembling hands. The Bolsheviks, disciplined and energized, sensed that the moment they had been waiting for was finally within reach. Lenin had returned from hiding in Finland, slipping quietly back into the city under cover of night. His beard was trimmed, his disguise discarded, but his urgency had only sharpened. He moved through Petrograd like a man racing against time, meeting with party leaders, writing feverishly, pressing his case with the intensity of someone who believed history itself was leaning toward him. The Bolshevik Central Committee met in secret, and the decision was made. The time for insurrection had come. The uprising would be coordinated with the opening of the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, a gathering of delegates from across the country. If the Bolsheviks could seize power just as the Congress convened, they could present the new government as the legitimate voice of the Soviets, the councils of workers and soldiers that had sprung up during the revolution. The task of executing the coup fell largely to Leon Trotsky, now chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. Trotsky approached the operation with a strategist's precision and a dramatist's flair. He organized the Military Revolutionary Committee, a body that gave the Bolsheviks a legal pretext to move armed units around the city. Under the guise of defending Petrograd from a rumored counter-revolution, Trotsky quietly positioned loyal soldiers and Red Guards at key points: bridges, telegraph stations, railway terminals, and government buildings. The city remained eerily calm. There were no barricades, no street battles, no crowds chanting slogans. Instead, the revolution unfolded like a slow, deliberate tightening of a net. On the night of October 24th, Red Guards began to move. They took control of the telephone exchange. They occupied the state bank. They seized the railway stations. Each action was carried out with minimal resistance, as if the old order were simply stepping aside. The provisional government, led by Kerensky, seemed paralyzed. Ministers argued, hesitated, and issued orders that no one obeyed. By the morning of October 25th, the Bolsheviks controlled most of Petrograd. Only the Winter Palace, seat of the provisional government, remained in government hands. The palace, once the glittering symbol of imperial power, now stood dim and drafty, guarded by a small and demoralized force of cadets and women soldiers. Its vast halls echoed with uncertainty. Kerensky, sensing the collapse of his government, fled the city in a borrowed car, hoping to rally loyal troops from the front. His departure left the remaining ministers isolated and increasingly aware that help would not come. As evening fell, the Aurora, a cruiser anchored on the Neva River, fired a single blank shot, a signal, not an attack. Red Guards and soldiers advanced on the Winter Palace. The storming of the palace, later mythologized as a dramatic clash, was in reality a slow, confused, almost anticlimactic affair. The defenders offered little resistance. The palace's endless corridors made navigation difficult. Some rooms were taken without a struggle, others were found empty. Shortly after midnight, the ministers of the provisional government were arrested. The revolution, the Second Revolution of 1917, was complete. At the Smolny Institute, where the Congress of Soviets was meeting, Trotsky stepped forward to address the delegates. His voice carried through the hall with a mixture of triumph and finality. "The provisional government has been deposed," he announced. He then turned to the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries who were storming out in protest and delivered a line that would echo through history. "Go where you belong, to the dustbin of history." The Congress approved the transfer of power. Lenin, appearing before the delegates with a quiet, unmistakable sense of victory, declared that the Soviets were now the governing authority of Russia. A new government, the Council of People's Commissars, was formed, with Lenin as its head. Outside, Petrograd remained strangely peaceful. The trams continued to run. Workers went to their shifts. The city, accustomed to hardship, absorbed the news with a kind of weary acceptance. Few realized that the events of that night would reshape not only Russia, but the entire course of the 20th century. The October Revolution had begun not with a roar, but with a quiet, methodical tightening of control. A revolution carried out in whispers, in footsteps, in the soft closing of doors behind a fading government. In the quiet hours after the October uprising, as Petrograd settled into an uneasy stillness, the Bolsheviks moved swiftly to transform their sudden victory into something more permanent. The Winter Palace had fallen with barely a struggle, the provisional government had dissolved into history, and the Congress of Soviets had declared Lenin's new administration the rightful authority of Russia. But the revolution was not yet secure. Power gained so quickly could slip away just as easily. Lenin understood this with absolute clarity. He had spent decades preparing for this moment, imagining it, arguing for it, shaping his party around it. And now that it had arrived, he wasted no time. The new government, the Council of People's Commissars, began issuing decrees with a speed that startled even some of Lenin's supporters. The tone was decisive, uncompromising, and unmistakably revolutionary. One of the first decrees abolished private ownership of land. Estates that had belonged to nobles, the church, and wealthy landowners were declared the property of the people. Peasants, who had long dreamed of owning the soil they worked, greeted the news with a mixture of relief and disbelief. For generations, land had been the central grievance of rural Russia, a source of resentment, conflict, and quiet despair. Now, with a single stroke of Lenin's pen, the old order of property had been swept aside. Another decree placed factories under the control of workers' committees. In theory, this meant that workers would now manage production, wages, and working conditions. In practice, it created a chaotic but exhilarating sense of empowerment. For the first time, workers felt that the machinery of industry, the engines, the furnaces, the assembly lines, belonged to them. The Bolsheviks also moved to nationalize banks, abolish class privileges, and establish revolutionary tribunals to enforce the new order. Each decree was both symbolic and practical, designed to dismantle the remnants of the old regime while signaling to the world that a new kind of government had taken root in Russia. But the most dramatic decree, the one that sent shockwaves across Europe, was the call for an immediate armistice. Russia had been bleeding for more than 3 years. Millions were dead, the army was disintegrating, the people were exhausted. Lenin had long argued that the war was a capitalist conflict, fought for imperial ambitions rather than the needs of ordinary people. Now, with the Bolsheviks in power, he acted on that belief. The new government announced its intention to negotiate peace with Germany and its allies. It was a stunning reversal of Russia's wartime commitments. The Western powers, Britain, France, and the United States, reacted with alarm. They had counted on Russia to keep pressure on the Eastern Front. Without Russia, Germany could shift its forces westward, threatening the fragile balance of the war. Diplomats in London and Paris viewed the Bolsheviks with deep suspicion. Their ideology, uncompromising, internationalist, openly hostile to capitalism, seemed like a threat not only to wartime strategy but to the entire political order of Europe. Newspapers described the new government as reckless, dangerous, even illegitimate. Some predicted it would collapse within weeks. Inside Russia, reactions were equally divided. Supporters of the revolution celebrated the decrees as long-awaited justice. Opponents saw them as reckless experiments that would plunge the country into deeper chaos. The provisional government had fallen, but the struggle for Russia's future had only begun. The Bolsheviks, however, moved forward with unwavering confidence. They believed that history was on their side, that the revolution in Russia would ignite similar uprisings across Europe, creating a wave of socialist transformation that would sweep away the old world. For the moment, though, Russia stood alone. Surrounded by enemies, burdened by war, and facing a collapsing economy, the new government stepped into the uncertain dawn of its own making. The decrees had been issued. The world had taken notice. And the next chapter, the struggle for peace, was about to begin. In the weeks following the October Revolution, Russia found itself standing at a crossroads, exhausted by war and shaken by political upheaval. The Bolsheviks had seized power with startling speed, but the country they now governed was fractured, hungry, and desperate for relief. The front lines had dissolved into chaos. Soldiers wandered home in long, weary columns. Villages waited anxiously for news. The winter winds carried not only cold, but a sense of uncertainty that seemed to seep into every corner of the land. Lenin understood that the revolution could not survive if the war continued. Russia had bled too much, lost too much, endured too much. The army was no longer an army in any meaningful sense. It was a vast, disintegrating mass of men who wanted nothing more than to return to their families and their fields. If the Bolsheviks tried to keep fighting, the revolution would collapse before it had a chance to take root. And so, with a mixture of urgency and pragmatism, Lenin pushed for peace. The new government called for an immediate armistice, and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, agreed to negotiations. The talks were to be held in the Polish fortress town of Brest-Litovsk, a place whose name would soon become synonymous with one of the most controversial treaties in Russian history. The Bolsheviks sent a delegation led by Leon Trotsky, whose sharp intellect and theatrical flair made him a compelling figure on the international stage. Trotsky approached diplomacy with the same intensity he brought to revolution: bold, confrontational, and unafraid to challenge the assumptions of his opponents. He arrived at Brest-Litovsk determined not only to negotiate, but to expose the imperial ambitions of the Central Powers. The German representatives, however, were equally determined. They held the advantage, militarily, politically, and geographically. Their armies occupied vast stretches of Russian territory, and they expected the Bolsheviks to accept harsh terms. The negotiations quickly became a clash of wills. Trotsky attempted a daring strategy. He declared that Russia would adopt a policy he described as neither war nor peace. Russia would not continue fighting, he said, but it would not sign a humiliating treaty either. It was a bold attempt to stall, to buy time, to inspire socialist uprisings in Germany and Austria that might shift the balance of power. But the Germans were unmoved. They resumed their advance, pushing deeper into Russian territory with alarming speed. The Bolsheviks, already struggling to maintain control at home, could not withstand another military blow. Inside the Bolshevik leadership, the debate grew fierce. Many argued that signing a punitive treaty would betray the revolution. Others insisted that refusing would doom it. The party split into factions: idealists, pragmatists, and those caught painfully between the two. Lenin, however, remained unwavering. He believed that the revolution's survival mattered more than territory, pride, or ideology. Russia needed peace, any peace, to consolidate its new government and rebuild its shattered society. "We must sign," he insisted, "even if the terms are shameful." The treaty that emerged was indeed harsh. Russia lost vast territories, lands rich in resources, industry, and population. It was a staggering concession, one that shocked even some of Lenin's closest allies. But the alternative, Lenin argued, was annihilation. On March 3, 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed. The reaction was immediate and intense. Across Europe, the Western allies were outraged. They had counted on Russia to keep pressure on the Eastern Front. Now, with Russia's withdrawal, Germany could shift its forces westward, threatening the fragile balance of the war. Diplomats in London and Paris condemned the Bolsheviks as traitors, radicals, and dangerous idealists. Inside Russia, the treaty deepened existing divisions. Some saw it as a necessary sacrifice. Others viewed it as a betrayal of the revolution's promise. The Bolsheviks had secured peace, but at a cost that would haunt them for years. Yet for Lenin, the treaty was not an end but a beginning. With the war behind them, the Bolsheviks could turn their attention inward, to rebuilding the state, consolidating power, and confronting the growing resistance that simmered across the country. The break with the West was complete. Russia stood alone, isolated and mistrusted, but determined to forge its own path. The revolution had survived its first great test, but the challenges ahead would be far greater. The ink on the treaty had barely dried when the next storm began to gather. In the months that followed the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Russia slipped into a new and darker chapter, one defined not by foreign armies, but by the bitter struggle within its own borders. The Bolsheviks had secured peace with Germany, but the price of that peace was steep, and the resentment it stirred helped ignite a conflict far more devastating than the war they had just escaped. The country was fractured. Old loyalties had dissolved. New allegiances were forming in the shadows. The revolution had toppled the monarchy and swept away the provisional government, but it had not settled the question of who should rule Russia. Instead, it opened a void, and into that void stepped a host of competing forces, each convinced that they alone represented the true future of the nation. The first sparks of civil war appeared almost immediately. Across the vast expanse of Russia, resistance to Bolshevik rule began to take shape. Former officers of the Imperial Army, liberals who had supported the provisional government, monarchists longing for the old order, and regional leaders seeking autonomy all found themselves united by a single conviction: the Bolsheviks must be stopped. These disparate groups would eventually coalesce into what became known as the White Movement, a loose, often disorganized coalition bound more by opposition than by shared vision. The Bolsheviks, for their part, responded with equal determination. They believed that the revolution was under siege, that enemies lurked in every corner, and that survival required vigilance and force. To defend the new government, they created a secret police organization, the Cheka, led by the austere and implacable Felix Dzerzhinsky. The Cheka operated with sweeping authority, empowered to arrest, interrogate, and execute those deemed counter-revolutionary. Its presence cast a long cold shadow across the country. Tensions escalated further in the summer of 1918, when an assassination attempt nearly killed Lenin. He survived, but the attack hardened the Bolsheviks' resolve. They believed the revolution was surrounded by enemies, both foreign and domestic, and they acted accordingly. The Cheka expanded its operations. Arrests increased. Executions became more frequent. The atmosphere grew heavy with fear and suspicion. At the same time, the Bolsheviks moved decisively against political rivals. The Constituent Assembly, elected after the revolution and dominated by the socialist revolutionaries, convened in January 1918. It was meant to represent the will of the people, but its vision for Russia clashed sharply with Lenin's. When the assembly refused to endorse Bolshevik policies, it was dissolved by force. The message was unmistakable. The Bolsheviks would tolerate no competing centers of power. The government also relocated from Petrograd to Moscow, a move driven by both strategic necessity and symbolic intent. Petrograd, vulnerable to German attack and rife with political tension, no longer felt secure. Moscow, older, more central, steeped in Russian history, became the new heart of the Soviet state. Meanwhile, the Civil War expanded in unexpected ways. One of the most dramatic developments came from the Czech Legion, a force of Czech and Slovak soldiers who had been fighting for Russia against the Central Powers. After the Bolsheviks signed the peace treaty, the Legion sought to travel east along the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok, where they hoped to sail to France and continue fighting the war from the Western Front. But tensions between the Legion and local Bolshevik authorities escalated into open conflict. Skirmishes broke out along the railway. The Legion seized control of key towns and vast stretches of the rail line, effectively cutting Russia in half. Their uprising inspired anti-Bolshevik forces across Siberia and the Urals, giving the White Movement a powerful foothold. By the end of 1918, Russia was engulfed in a sprawling, chaotic civil war. The front lines were fluid, stretching across thousands of miles. Armies rose and fell. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Villages were caught between rival factions, each demanding loyalty, supplies, and recruits. The conflict was not a single war, but a constellation of wars, political, regional, ideological, and deeply personal. The revolution had survived its birth, but now it faced a far greater test. The struggle for Russia's future had begun in earnest, and the outcome was anything but certain. As the Russian Civil War widened into a vast and tangled conflict, the Bolsheviks faced a challenge that threatened the very survival of their revolution. They had seized power, but they did not yet possess an army capable of defending it. The old imperial forces had dissolved into confusion. Soldiers had deserted in staggering numbers. Officers were scattered, disillusioned, or openly hostile to the new regime. Russia, enormous and exposed, needed a military force that could be rebuilt almost from nothing. Into this void stepped Leon Trotsky. Trotsky, already a commanding presence in the Petrograd Soviet and a central architect of the October Revolution, now took on a role that would define his legacy. He became the People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs, and with that title came the responsibility of forging a new army, an army that could withstand the White forces, foreign intervention, regional uprisings, and the sheer chaos of a country tearing itself apart. He approached the task with a mixture of intellectual rigor and fierce determination. Trotsky was not a soldier by training, but he possessed a strategist's mind and a revolutionary's will. He understood that the Red Army could not be built on enthusiasm alone. It needed structure, discipline, and leadership, even if that leadership came from unexpected places. One of Trotsky's most controversial decisions was to recruit former Tsarist officers into the Red Army. These were men who had once served the monarchy, who had been trained in the traditions of the old regime, and who were often viewed with deep suspicion by Bolshevik loyalists. But Trotsky recognized their value. They knew how to command troops, how to organize logistics, how to wage war on a scale that the revolution demanded. To ensure their loyalty, Trotsky paired them with political commissars, dedicated Bolsheviks who monitored their actions, enforced ideological discipline, and ensured that the army remained firmly under party control. It was an uneasy partnership, but it worked. The commissars became the ideological backbone of the Red Army, while the former officers provided the technical expertise needed to turn raw recruits into effective soldiers. Trotsky also imposed strict discipline. Desertion, looting, and insubordination were met with harsh penalties. The revolution, he argued, could not survive without order. His methods were often severe, but they reflected the desperate circumstances of the time. Russia was fighting for its life, and Trotsky believed that only a disciplined, centralized army could save it. To inspire and oversee this new force, Trotsky traveled constantly. He crisscrossed the country in a specially equipped armored train, a mobile command center that became a symbol of his leadership. The train carried printing presses, supplies, and a small detachment of loyal troops. Wherever the fighting was fiercest, Trotsky appeared, stepping onto the platform of his train to deliver speeches that blended urgency with conviction. He spoke to exhausted soldiers, to frightened recruits, to commanders struggling to hold their lines. His presence had a galvanizing effect. He reminded them that they were not merely fighting for territory, but for the survival of the revolution itself, for a future that had not yet taken shape, but that depended entirely on their endurance. Under Trotsky's direction, the Red Army grew with astonishing speed. What had begun as a scattered collection of militias and volunteer units became a force numbering in the millions. It was not always well equipped, nor was it always well fed, but it possessed something the White armies often lacked: a unified purpose, a central command, and a leadership that understood the stakes of the conflict. By late 1918 and into 1919, the Red Army had become the decisive instrument of Bolshevik power. It pushed back White offensives, reclaimed lost territory, and began to turn the tide of the Civil War. The revolution, once fragile and uncertain, now had a shield, forged in crisis, hardened by necessity, and shaped by Trotsky's relentless will. The Red Army was far from perfect. It was born in turmoil, sustained by discipline, and often driven by fear as much as ideology. But it was effective. And in the brutal landscape of the Russian Civil War, effectiveness meant survival. The Bolsheviks had found their army, and with it, they found the means to defend and ultimately preserve their revolution. As the Russian Civil War deepened, the country seemed to slip into a long, unbroken twilight, a landscape of shifting front lines, abandoned villages, and weary soldiers trudging through mud and snow. The conflict was vast, sprawling across thousands of miles, and its brutality seeped into every corner of daily life. It was not a single war, but a constellation of wars, political, regional, ethnic, and deeply personal. And in the midst of this turmoil, the fate of the former imperial family became one of the most haunting threads in the tapestry of Russia's unraveling. The White Armies, though united in their opposition to the Bolsheviks, were fractured in purpose and geography. Some fought for the restoration of the monarchy. Others dreamed of a liberal republic. Still others sought regional autonomy or military dictatorship. Their offensives surged across the map like unpredictable tides, pushing toward Moscow one month, collapsing under counterattacks the next. Foreign powers joined the struggle as well. British, French, American, and Japanese forces landed in scattered ports, hoping to reopen the Eastern Front or prevent Bolshevism from spreading. Their presence added another layer of complexity to a conflict already tangled with competing ambitions. The Red Army, forged under Trotsky's relentless discipline, fought back with growing strength. But the cost was immense. Entire towns were burned. Crops were seized or destroyed. Civilians found themselves caught between armies that demanded loyalty, food, and shelter. The countryside echoed with the sounds of gunfire, the rumble of trains, and the quiet, desperate movements of families fleeing the violence. Atrocities occurred on all sides. The Whites carried out brutal reprisals against suspected Bolshevik sympathizers. The Reds responded with their own harsh measures, often under the direction of the Cheka. The Civil War blurred the lines between battlefield and home, between soldier and civilian. It was a conflict without mercy, driven by ideology, fear, and the raw instinct to survive. Amid this chaos, the Romanov family, once the embodiment of imperial grandeur, lived in quiet captivity. After Nicholas II's abdication, he, Alexandra, and their 5 children had been moved from palace to palace, each transfer taking them farther from the world they once ruled. Their days became a monotony of confinement. Reading, sewing, tending a small garden, writing in diaries that grew increasingly somber. By the summer of 1918, they were held in the city of Yekaterinburg, in a house that had been converted into a fortified prison. Guards patrolled the halls. Windows were painted over. The family lived under constant surveillance, their world reduced to a few dim rooms and the faint sounds of the city beyond the walls. As the White Armies advanced through the Urals, drawing closer to Yekaterinburg, the Bolsheviks faced a grim dilemma. They feared that if the Romanovs were liberated, the Whites would use them as a rallying symbol, a living banner for the restoration of the old order. The revolution, still fragile and embattled, could not risk such a possibility. And so, in the early hours of July 17, 1918, the decision was carried out. The Romanovs were awakened and told they were being moved for their safety. Instead, they were led to a basement room. What followed was swift, chaotic, and deeply tragic. The entire family, Nicholas, Alexandra, their daughters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and their young son Alexei, was executed. The news spread slowly at first, then with a shock that rippled across Russia and the world. Even among the Bolsheviks, reactions were mixed. Some saw the act as a harsh necessity of war. Others felt a quiet unease, sensing that a line had been crossed that could never be undone. Lenin's response was characteristically restrained. He offered no public celebration, no dramatic justification. The revolution, he believed, demanded difficult choices, and this had been one of them. Trotsky later wrote that the execution was necessary to prevent the monarchy from rising again, describing it as a grim but unavoidable step in the struggle for power. The civil war raged on, but the death of the Romanovs cast a long shadow over the conflict. It symbolized the final, irrevocable break with Russia's imperial past, a past that had shaped the nation for more than 3 centuries. The old world had not simply fallen, it had been extinguished. And as the fighting continued, as armies clashed and cities burned, the memory of the imperial family lingered like a ghost, a reminder of what had been lost, and of the terrible price the revolution was willing to pay to secure its future. By 1919, the Russian Civil War had reached a fevered pitch. The country felt like a vast, wounded landscape, cities dimmed by shortages, villages hollowed by hunger, rail lines choked with refugees and soldiers moving in opposite directions. The conflict had become a kind of national exhaustion, a grinding struggle that seemed to stretch endlessly across plains, forests, and frozen rivers. Yet beneath the chaos, a shift was beginning. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the balance of power tilted toward the Bolsheviks. The White armies, despite early successes, were unraveling. Their offensives had surged with dramatic force, sweeping through Siberia, pushing toward Moscow from the south, threatening Petrograd from the north. But their momentum could not be sustained. They lacked unity, they lacked a shared vision, and most critically, they lacked the support of the people whose loyalty they desperately needed. The Whites promised a return to law and order, but what that meant varied wildly from one commander to another. Some dreamed of restoring the monarchy. Others envisioned a military dictatorship. Still others wanted a liberal republic. Their disagreements fractured their strategy, their morale, and their ability to govern the territories they captured. In many regions, White rule brought harsh reprisals, forced requisitions, and a sense of dread that pushed peasants and workers toward the Bolsheviks, not out of ideological devotion, but out of a desperate desire for stability. The Civil War had become a contest not only of armies, but of legitimacy. And in that contest, the Whites faltered. Meanwhile, the Red Army, forged under Trotsky's relentless discipline, grew stronger with each passing month. It was not a perfect force, far from it, but it possessed something the Whites could not match: a unified command, a clear purpose, and a leadership that understood the stakes of the conflict with cold precision. Trotsky's armored train crisscrossed the front lines, appearing like a steel apparition wherever the fighting was fiercest. His speeches, sharp and urgent, reminded soldiers that they were defending not just territory, but the revolution itself, the fragile, still-forming idea of a new Russia. Commissars enforced discipline. Former Tsarist officers provided expertise, and the rank-and-file soldiers, drawn from factories and fields, fought with a grim determination born of necessity. The Bolsheviks also controlled the industrial heartlands, Petrograd, Moscow, the central manufacturing regions, giving them access to weapons, railways, and communication networks that the Whites struggled to match. The Red Army could move troops quickly along the rail lines, reinforcing weak points and launching counterattacks with surprising speed. By contrast, the White armies were scattered across vast distances, often separated by thousands of miles of hostile territory. Their supply lines were fragile. Their coordination was poor, and their foreign allies, Britain, France, the United States, Japan, offered only limited support, often driven more by fear of Bolshevism than by genuine commitment to the White cause. As 1919 turned to 1920, the tide became unmistakable. In the east, Admiral Alexander Kolchak, the self-proclaimed supreme ruler of Russia, saw his forces collapse under Red counterattacks. His government disintegrated. He was captured and executed. In the south, General Anton Denikin pushed toward Moscow but was forced into a long chaotic retreat that ended in evacuation from the Black Sea coast. In the northwest, General Yudenich came within sight of Petrograd's outskirts, only to be driven back by Red reinforcements and the city's workers' militias. One by one, the White offensives faltered, then failed, then dissolved entirely. The Civil War did not end all at once. It faded, slowly, like a storm losing strength. Pockets of resistance remained, in the Crimea, in the Far East, in remote regions where local warlords held sway, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Bolsheviks had survived the greatest threat to their revolution. They had outlasted their enemies, consolidated their power, and begun to shape the foundations of a new state. Yet victory came at a staggering cost. Russia was devastated. Millions were dead. Cities lay in ruins. The countryside was scarred by famine, disease, and the memory of violence. Families were scattered. Communities were broken. The revolution had been preserved, but the country it claimed to represent was exhausted, traumatized, and profoundly changed. Still, for Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership, the triumph was undeniable. Against overwhelming odds, they had held their ground. They had defeated armies backed by foreign powers. They had transformed a fragile uprising into a functioning government. And they had secured control over the vast expanse of Russia. The Civil War had forged the Soviet state in fire and hardship. Now, with the guns falling silent, the Bolsheviks turned toward the next challenge, rebuilding a shattered nation and defining what their revolution would become. By 1920, the Russian Civil War had entered its final, grueling phase. The country felt like a vast, exhausted organism, drained by years of conflict, scarred by famine and disease, and haunted by the memory of battles that had swept across its plains like storms. Yet beneath the fatigue, a decisive shift had taken hold. The Bolsheviks, hardened by necessity and unified by purpose, were closing in on victory. The White movement, once formidable, was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The White armies, scattered across the edges of the former empire, were now fighting desperate, isolated campaigns. Their early momentum had evaporated. Their supply lines were broken. Their political vision, never unified, never coherent, had fractured into competing dreams of what Russia should become. Monarchists, liberals, nationalists, and military strongmen all marched under the same banner, but they did not march toward the same future. In the south, General Anton Denikin had once pushed dangerously close to Moscow. His forces swept through the Don region, capturing cities and rail hubs, raising hopes among his supporters that the Bolsheviks might be crushed. But the Red Army counterattacked with relentless force. Denikin's troops, stretched thin and plagued by shortages, were driven back in a long, chaotic retreat. By early 1920, his army had disintegrated. Denikin fled into exile, leaving behind a shattered command. In the east, Admiral Alexander Kolchak, the self-proclaimed supreme ruler of Russia, had suffered an equally devastating fate. His armies, once the backbone of the White resistance in Siberia, collapsed under Red offensives and the uprisings of local partisans. Kolchak was captured, handed over to the Bolsheviks, and executed. His death symbolized the unraveling of the White cause, a movement that had lost not only territory, but direction. In the northwest, General Nikolai Yudenich launched a bold assault on Petrograd, coming within sight of the city's outskirts. But the Red Army, reinforced by workers' militias and driven by the symbolic importance of the former capital, repelled the attack. Yudenich's forces retreated into Estonia, where they were disarmed and dissolved. One by one, the White offensives collapsed like waves breaking against a rocky shore. The Bolsheviks, by contrast, grew stronger with each victory. The Red Army, forged under Trotsky's relentless discipline, had become a formidable force, not always well-equipped, not always well-fed, but unified, mobile, and strategically coordinated. The Bolsheviks controlled the industrial heartlands, the rail networks, and the central administrative centers. They could move troops quickly, reinforce weak points, and maintain a level of organization the Whites could not match. But the final chapter of the Civil War unfolded far from Moscow or Petrograd, in the rugged, windswept peninsula of the Crimea. There, the last major White commander, General Pyotr Wrangel, made his stand. Wrangel was a disciplined, thoughtful leader, respected even by some of his enemies. He attempted reforms the other White commanders had ignored: land redistribution, local autonomy, a more coherent political program. But it was too late. The Whites were exhausted, their support eroded, their cause overshadowed by years of brutality and mismanagement. In late 1920, the Red Army launched a massive offensive into the Crimea. The fighting was fierce, but the outcome was inevitable. Wrangel realized that further resistance would mean slaughter without purpose. In a remarkable act of organization and humanity, he arranged the evacuation of his army and tens of thousands of civilians. Ships crowded the harbors of Sevastopol and other Crimean ports, carrying soldiers, families, and refugees into exile, a final, sorrowful exodus of the old Russia. With Wrangel's departure, the last major White force vanished from the battlefield. The Civil War did not end instantly. Pockets of resistance lingered: Cossack uprisings, peasant rebellions, regional warlords in the Far East. But the great struggle for control of Russia was over. The Bolsheviks had won. The cost, however, was almost beyond comprehension. Russia was devastated. Cities lay in ruins. Railways were twisted wreckage. Villages were emptied by famine, disease, and the relentless demands of armies passing through. Millions were dead. Millions more displaced. Families were scattered across continents. The social fabric of the country, already strained before the revolution, had been torn apart. Yet for Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership, the victory was absolute. Against overwhelming odds, they had survived foreign intervention, internal rebellion, and the combined forces of the old order. They had transformed a fragile uprising into a functioning state, and they had secured control over the vast, wounded expanse of Russia. The Civil War had forged the Soviet regime in fire and hardship. Now, With the guns falling silent, the Bolsheviks turned toward the monumental task of rebuilding and reshaping a nation that had been remade by revolution. When the guns of the Civil War were still thundering across Russia's vast interior, the Bolsheviks found themselves confronting a new and equally daunting challenge: how to keep a shattered nation alive. The economy had collapsed. Railways lay in ruins. Factories stood silent or half-abandoned. The countryside, ravaged by requisitions and fighting, teetered on the edge of famine. In this bleak landscape, the Bolsheviks adopted a set of emergency policies that would come to be known as war communism, a system born not from ideological purity, but from the desperate need to survive. War communism was not a single decree or a neatly organized program. It was a patchwork of measures, improvised under pressure, hardened by necessity, and enforced with a severity that reflected the chaos of the time. Its guiding principle was simple: the revolution must not starve, and the Red Army must not fall. To achieve this, the state seized control of nearly every aspect of economic life. Factories were nationalized, even small workshops that had once been family-run. Managers were replaced or subordinated to political commissars. Production quotas were imposed. The government attempted to direct industry from the top down, issuing orders that often collided with the grim realities of broken machinery, missing workers, and empty supply depots. In the countryside, the policy was even harsher. Grain was requisitioned directly from peasants, not purchased, not bargained for, but taken. Armed detachments, often accompanied by Cheka agents, moved from village to village demanding food for the cities and the army. Many peasants resisted, hiding grain or refusing to cooperate. The Bolsheviks responded with force. Skirmishes erupted. Entire regions rebelled. The countryside became a patchwork of quiet defiance and sudden violence. Money itself began to lose meaning. Inflation soared until the ruble was little more than paper. In its place, the state attempted to create a system of rationing and direct distribution. Workers received food, clothing, and fuel through their factories or local Soviets. Barter replaced currency. Life became a daily negotiation for survival. The cities suffered terribly. Petrograd, once the glittering capital of the empire, saw its population fall by more than half as residents fled to the countryside in search of food. Moscow fared little better. Streets that had once bustled with trams and crowds now felt hollow, echoing with the footsteps of the hungry and the weary. Factories operated at a fraction of their former capacity. The cold seeped into every room, every workshop, every conversation. Yet even in this bleakness, the Bolsheviks pressed forward. They believed that the hardships were temporary, the unavoidable cost of defending the revolution against enemies within and without. They argued that war communism was not merely an emergency measure, but a glimpse of the future, a society without markets, without private property, without the old capitalist rhythms. But the reality was far more complicated. War communism strained the relationship between the Bolsheviks and the very people they claimed to represent. Peasants resented the grain seizures. Workers chafed under strict labor discipline. Soldiers, exhausted by years of fighting, grew restless. The Cheka's expanding authority cast a long shadow over daily life, instilling fear even among those who supported the revolution. By 1920, famine loomed. Epidemics swept through weakened communities. Entire regions were on the brink of collapse. The Civil War had taken its toll, but war communism, harsh, improvised, unyielding, deepened the suffering. Still, from the Bolshevik perspective, the system had achieved its most essential goal. The Red Army had been fed, supplied, and kept in the field long enough to win the war. Without war communism, the revolution might have been crushed. With it, the Bolsheviks had survived, but at a staggering human cost. As the Civil War drew to a close, Lenin and his closest advisors began to recognize that the policies which had sustained them in wartime could not sustain the country in peace. The economy was in ruins. The people were exhausted. The revolution itself was at risk of collapsing under the weight of its own emergency measures. A new direction would soon be needed, one that would reshape the Soviet state once again. But for now, in the dim, hungry years of 1918 to 1921, war communism stood as the stark embodiment of a revolution fighting for its life, clinging to survival through discipline, coercion, and the unshakable belief that the future demanded sacrifice.